Today, we are going back to school. Today, we're going back to school with one of the most famous characters in all of the Bible. In fact, we did a series on him 5 years ago. It's hard to believe for me that it's been that long, but 5 years ago, we did a series called Old School with this character, and we're going to go back to school with him now. So that series was 7 messages, and this one is 3. So we're going to just highlight a piece of his life. There we unpack the whole thing, so you can go back and listen to it and look at us and how much different we look now and how much grayer some of us are than others. And but anyway, it is on our YouTube, I guess, if you want to go back and see that. But this time we're going to spend 3 messages unpacking a principle of going back to school. When I think about going back to school, I never enjoyed that as a kid. In fact, I talked to a kid this morning. She's like, I can't wait to go back to school. And I was thinking, I never felt that way necessarily, right? But one of my favorite school years was in 7th grade. And how many people grew up in Windsor or went to Windsor schools or are not willing to admit that? No, I'm just playing. No. So I did. I went to Windsor, and it used to be that where the middle school is now, where the middle school is now, it used to be the elementary school because they didn't have a middle school. They just had an elementary school and a high school. And it wasn't the school that's there now because they tore the old one down and built this new one that's really awesome. But the one we went to was it was built pre-World War I, I guess. I don't really know, but it was pretty old, you know what I'm saying? And but it was okay. And but my favorite teacher I met him when I was in 7th grade. Because when you're in 7th grade in a school that, hey, they don't have a middle school, you're the oldest ones in the class. So it's kind of like, hey, it's really cool to be in 7th grade before you get to go to high school. And my favorite teacher was my homeroom teacher, and his name was Milton Kemp. And does anybody know Mr. Kemp? So he was a really awesome teacher. He did a couple of things that were not normal even back then. Like he had a paddle in the class, which was really weird. Anyway, he also let us eat in the class, which was against the rules, but Milton Kemp would let you do that. He was outside the box thinking. And one of the other things that I always remember about him, and I don't know if I should be sharing this in church, but I'm going to do it anyway, so that's usually a bad sign. But right at the last bell before we left the class, he would get a cigarette right before, and he would put it in his mouth. And as soon as the bell rang, he would light up a cigarette right in the class. And then, that's not the cool part. But the cool part was he would blow smoke rings that were big as the classroom. It was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. Anyway, that was Mr. Kemp. I mean, I'm not lying. That's who he was, and that's probably why he's not a teacher now. But anyway, but he had a big impact on my life, and not just because of those things. I didn't pick up smoking or anything like that. But what the impact that Mr. Kemp had on my life was this, is that he expanded the way that I looked at the world. He had a different philosophy. He came at it from a different angle, obviously, than most teachers. That's why I described some of those things, that he thought outside the box, and he helped me do that, and he challenged just the status quo thinking. And it was basically like this: hey, you've been thinking about life like this, and that's gotten you to where you're at, but you really need to look at it from some different angles. Not be so judgmental about everybody in the world or not understanding different things. And it really changed my life. And even to this day, in fact, I just sent him a Facebook message. I don't know if he'll get it right now because the older you are, the less you check that kind of stuff. So, but I did send it to him just to tell him how big of an impact. Sometimes teachers don't know. I say that today because I have a feeling that's what God wants to do in this series for us. He wants to expand our thinking. Things that we see all the time, that he's going, I need you to look at it a little bit differently. He wants to change your paradigm. He wants to change the way you think. And I have a feeling we can do that through the life of this character. So I want to introduce this character to you today, and I want to give you the big picture principle and kind of come to it, because if you don't get this, you're never really going to have the power of God in your life. You're going to be confused about how God is operating in this world, but more than that, in your life. And so I want to really make sure we get this principle. The principle is this, is that the recognition of success is not success, if that makes sense. If you're not careful, you'll think that it is. In other words, when I say that, it's just like going to school. When you graduate, you go, oh man, when somebody graduates, we come up to them and we say, we're so proud of you, right? Today, you're a success. But that's not exactly true. Some of us are just like, hey man, I don't know what it takes, but just get my kid out of school, right? But it's a big event, it's a big moment, but that's not the day you become a success. Success is not an event, it's a journey. Does that make sense? I remember John Maxwell wrote a book called Success Journey, And he actually had to really argue for the title because the publisher said no. The publisher actually gets to name the book. And I remember him saying this at a conference we went to. He said, I had to fly to the publisher and say, no, you cannot name it Journey to Success because success is not a destination. It's a journey. That it's day by day, not in a day. Not the day that you're just recognized for it. So don't think of it as a destination. And some of us, that's where we're at, thinking, hey, if I could finally get here, then I've arrived. If I could finally learn this, then it's, I do this, and now I've graduated and I'm done. And what I need to tell you today is this, is that the way God makes champions is not in an event. In fact, the church is not set up for this philosophy. We're very good at events. We're not very good sometimes. Church people are not very good at the process. And we think that the event will do more for us than the process, when I'm going to tell you today that what we've learned and what we're going to learn from the life of this man. And that's why I want to give it to you now, because it's going to take a while to conceive of this thought. But when this unlocks in your mind, it's going to take your faith to a whole nother level. And it's this, that champions are not made in the event, they're made in the process. And if you get that, then you're going to get a key that's going to unlock the power of God in your life. If you don't, you're going to think that life is very random. You're going to think life is very random. You're going to think, oh, when it's up, it's like this, and when it's down, it's like this, and where is God, just like we talked about in the last series. But here's what you got to know, is that God's champions are built in the process. And today we're going to help you with that, and we're going to help you with what that process is, okay? So turn with me to Exodus chapter 3, and we're going to take a look at this man's life. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1, it says this, now Moses, if you want to circle that, we're going to be talking about Moses. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Verse 2. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire within a bush. And Moses saw that through the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. Now, so let me just kind of explain. We're kind of in on the narrator part. He did not see an angel of God. What Moses saw was he was a shepherd who was out keeping his sheep, and he noticed in the desert that a bush was on fire, which is not unusual at all. Bushes catch on fire all the time. But what was weird is hey, I went by it this morning and it was on fire, and then I came back in the afternoon and it was still on fire. That's weird. Verse 3. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. Verse 4. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush. Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here am I. Verse 5. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. This is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. If you've never heard it, then that's great because you're hearing it today. But it's one of the most famous stories in the Bible of the burning bush and Moses and this huge life-altering event in the life of Moses. I will tell you that this event seems so random as though, and when we get into it, you'll see how random this looks. Like, why did God just show up out of the blue to this guy that was tending sheep? In order to understand how random it must have seemed to Moses, let me explain what led up to this moment in Moses' life. You can read about it for yourself in Exodus chapters 1 through chapter 4. And for us, it's 4 chapters. For Moses, it was a long span of time. Moses was born an Israelite, but not in the land of Israel. He was born in the land of Egypt when the Israelites were slaves. They had been slaves for nearly 400 years. They came to Egypt when Israel was just a family, that Abraham was a man that God called out of the land of the Chaldeans, ancient Mesopotamia, and he said, I will give you a land and I will give you a family, which was weird because Moses was old, and he was too old to be having children, but God allowed him and his wife to have a child of promise named Isaac. And so it was Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob. And Jacob, his grandson, actually his name was changed by God to Israel. So Israel was actually a family before it was a big nation. And Israel, whose name is Jacob, or whose name was Jacob, he had 11 sons. Now we think of it as 12 because there's 12 tribes of Israel, but one of the sons actually has 2 tribes. And so when they started, that's who they were. Now, how did they end up in Egypt? Because God gave them the land of Israel to be their inheritance. It says forever. But they ended up in Egypt because there was a great famine on earth. And what happened was the brothers, they had a dysfunctional family, and the brothers had sold their brother into slavery. And through a course of events, he interpreted a dream for Pharaoh. And Joseph, when he was in Egypt, he actually became second in command, and he helped the world be saved from a famine. And that made him super powerful. And then the Israelites, the family of Israel, came to Egypt. He forgave his brothers, and they came to Egypt. You can read all this at the end of the book of Genesis. This is where Genesis ends. And they came to Egypt, and they had a partnership with the Egyptians. And the family, but they asked them, they said, hey, Israel, would you not live in Egypt proper? Because here's the problem. If you live here, you're going to offend us with your ways because you're shepherds. This is a very important part of the story. You're shepherds, and that's detestable to an Egyptian. We don't like shepherds, okay? We just don't, this is not our culture. We think we look down on shepherds. So we love you guys, but you guys get your own land in the land of Goshen, and so that's where they spent. And so at the beginning, it was good. And they had a great partnership, and Joseph died really good. It saved the people of God. It saved the world, and it was an amazing account of what happened, and that ends the book of Genesis. We pick up in Exodus. They had been slaves for 400 years. That after that Pharaoh died, they took them as slaves because of their ethnicity. They were just like, hey, you're different than we are. We'll take you as slaves. This happened. That's just been the history of mankind. And so they became slaves, and they would cry out to God, and it got worse and worse. But every time they oppressed the children of Israel, they became even more harder. It was kind of like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and that's what happened to them. The more they would beat them, the more they were hard on them, it actually made them stronger, and they ended up having more children than the Egyptians. And they were like, we got to do something about this. So they basically did a genocide. We see that in society today. They tried to kill every male-born child. They said the soldiers of Egypt would come and throw them into the Nile River. That's when Moses was born. And they should have gotten Moses, but his mom tried to protect him. And so what she does in Exodus chapter 2 is she takes Moses and she forms a basket and she puts him in the Nile River, and his sister Miriam watches over him. They didn't have a plan. It was just like, hey, this is just like, hey, we're going to see if God will protect Moses. And he does. Through what seemed to be a coincidence, Pharaoh's daughter found him in the Nile River. She was out there bathing, and she saw him, and she got him out of the basket, and she thought, hey, this is kind of a miracle. I don't know if she couldn't have children or she did have children, but anyway, she wanted to take Moses as her own child. But she said, hey, I can't take him right now because he really needs to be breastfed. He really needs to be taken care of. So I'll get him at age 5. Anybody wish they could bypass the toddler years and stuff like that? Anyway. I'll get him when he's age 5. But is there anybody that could take care of him? And it happened to be Miriam was there, his sister, and she said, oh, I know somebody, right? And so Moses' own mother got to spend from infancy to age 5. Don't think those years are not important. In fact, as a church, we understand that, and that's one of the reasons why we spend a lot of time on our curriculum and in our kids' church, and my wife leads that ministry right now. If you want to know anything they're doing, she would be thrilled to talk to you about it. Because even at those young ages, they're starting to learn the things of God. We don't just babysit them in there. We have a curriculum that teaches about the things of God. Because we saw, and even in the life of Moses, you'll see that what happens in the life of Moses is he starts to learn about the things of God. She teaches him until age 5. You are not an Egyptian. You are an Israelite. And God one day has promised to raise a deliverer. And I believe she might have told him, hey, you're probably that deliverer. And you know why you'd think that, right? You're going to have more advantages than any Israelite in the last 400 years. You're going to be in Pharaoh's house. You're going to learn from the greatest people on the planet. But when you learn these things, don't ever forget you're one of God's chosen people. You are an Israelite, Moses. And one day, God will deliver us. And I'm not so sure you're not the deliverer he promised. He never forgot. We know that. And if you watch how the story progresses, it's only a few chapters, but you can even see in his mind that he never forgot who he was. And the older he got, when he got around age 40, he looked at the oppression of his people. And he saw how they would beat them. And one day he saw as a guard beat an elderly man, and it made him angry, and he struck the guard. I think he might have thought in the back of his mind, hey, maybe they'll rise up with me. You see, Moses wasn't an intimidated leader. We know through history he was a general in Pharaoh's army, that he was a powerful man. I'm not so sure that he might not have even had a place in the rule of Egypt if he had stayed in leadership. He was a great leader. And I think he thought to himself, hey, if I strike out, I think the people will rise up with me. There's over 2 million Israelites. We can overtake them, and we'll leave, and I'll be the deliverer that God is calling, right? But that's not what happened. He tried to help, but instead they betrayed him. He tried to help, and nobody helped him, so he buried the Egyptian guy, and then later he saw the Israelites fighting amongst themselves, and he said, hey, I don't think you should fight amongst yourselves. Don't you have enough? Egypt is the enemy. Don't fight amongst yourself. And they said, hey, are you going to kill us like you killed the other guy? Right? They kind of turned on him. And Pharaoh knew that he had killed someone. And Pharaoh was going to put out any insurrection from this Hebrew that was supposed to be like a son to me. And he put out a death warrant on Moses. How does that feel? You ever been there? I thought I could be the deliverer. God needs a deliverer, and I'm the man, right? And he fled. I think partially out of fear, but he was a soldier. I think partially out of anger and betrayal and resentment, and if the people don't want the help, then, right? And he ran. He was smart, strategic. Told you how smart he was. He ran across the desert because he knew the soldiers would have a hard time chasing him down. And he went as far as he could go to a place he knew they would never come, to a little podunk town in the middle of nowhere in Isle of Wight County called Zunot. No, I'm just playing. That's not true. It's not the end of the earth, but you can see it. Okay. They don't even have broadband internet connection. Okay, I'm done. It's like the third world. Okay, so he goes from being in the Mecca of the world to being the greatest leader to some no-name town in the middle of nowhere called Midian. You'd been to Midian, you wouldn't know you'd been to Midian. They didn't know him. That's how disconnected they were. And he met a lady on the first day, and he married this lady. There's some good things that happened in his life. And he gave up the scepter of rule. He gave up the sword of a soldier. You know what he gave it up for? A shepherd's staff. You ever thought about why he became a shepherd? It's the last place they would look for him. Remember I told you? The Egyptians hated shepherds. He was raised to think they're the worst of all people. That's the lowest job you could possibly have. And for 40 years, he was a shepherd. I believe in the land of Midian, his dream died every day, right? At age 40, okay, I still remember, right? Age 41, 45, age 50. By the time you're getting 60, right, you're thinking, by the time you're 70, I don't think I'm the deliverer anymore. Right? My time has passed. And I have it in the land of Goshen, but it just really doesn't seem like much. And then, can you imagine at age 80 that God just shows up in a burning bush and says, well, take off your sandals. Well, let's see what God says, verse 6. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, we've heard this because we just heard it in Genesis, right? It's only a few chapters away. For Moses, he's 80 years old. I haven't heard these words in 40 years. I haven't heard Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I haven't heard those names in 40 years. It's like God just showed up out of the blue, and it's like, what? Like no time has passed. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God, of course, because I'm sorry, it is a little weird, right? Right? A bush is on fire, and all of a sudden it's like, what is it? I'm just looking at why it's not burning up, and then he realizes God is speaking to me. He's thinking, I'm 80, maybe I didn't take my Geritol or something, and I'm hearing things, or whatever. Or, maybe I'm having a stroke. What's happening here? And here he is. And he hid his face. Let's listen to what God says next, verse 7. And then the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them cry out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. You are, huh? 400 years? This is so random, right? Think of it this way. Think about Moses actually hearing these words. He's like, you're concerned. 80 of the 400 years I've been alive. Some of you might not recognize it, but you will in a minute, because I got a feeling this is where you're at in your life, and you have no idea what God's doing, and it seems just as random as what it feels like to Moses. Verse 8. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites. I mean, you get it. Okay. Verse 9. And now the cry of Israel has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Here's the verse I want you to lean into, verse 10. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Can you imagine what that felt like to Moses? What? You're finally going to do something great. And this 80-year-old man who hasn't heard these names in 40 years, he hasn't heard any of this stuff, as all of a sudden God is saying, now I want you to go. Now, how random does that seem, right? Today? I mean, like, no prep, just go? Yeah. Start, go tell Pharaoh, right? I mean, that's basically what he's saying. He's going, hey, you're a shepherd, you're not a shepherd anymore, I want you to go to Pharaoh. Where were you when I was 40, right? I tried this, remember? In fact, let's see what Moses has to say, because this is important. Verse 11. But Moses, you want to circle that? In fact, right above Moses, put your name, okay? I got a feeling if you've been through anything hard, you're probably saying the same thing. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I? There's so much behind that question. You know, I could have maybe done that when I was 40. I believed in all this stuff. But God, it's been 40 years, and I'm old. And every now and then I would dream about the stuff in Egypt, but I couldn't do anything about it. And now you just say go as though it's just so random, right? Is it random? There's something here that if you could so easily miss it, yet it is found in every great leader that God has ever made. If you want to be a great leader, there is something here that you have to get. Can I tell you what it is? It's the success journey, not journey to success. That there's something that happened in Midian that made Moses into the man of God that God wanted. And if you miss this, you will never truly have the power of God in your life, because you will look at it and you will think, hey, it's just an event. It's so random. God just picked Moses out of the blue. God came down as though there was no pattern at all. But what I need to tell you is between the call on your life and between the vision that God has for the future, most of us know that, right? I mean, like, when I say vision, I mean good things. That I want my life to be better, I want my kids to be better, I want the world to be better, I want the vision, and God shows you some of these things. Between that and the actual event when it happens, there is a process. And what I need you to hear me say today is this, that champions are not made in the event, they're made in the process. The way that you become God's champion, you have to embrace his process. This is important. Because otherwise, it's going to look so random. So I want to give you a couple of things to take with you on that, and you can just go back and read these characters for yourself. So I'm going to give you a couple characters just so you can see that I'm not just saying this just because this happened in the life of Moses and I'm imposing this. I'm telling you, you will see this pattern in every person's life that God's ever used. Last week, we finished up a series on the book of Job, the same process we see in the life of Job. Between God giving Job the word of God, there is a span of time, there's even suffering that happens in the life of Job that leads him to the big moment of faith, to a faith that overwhelms his fear. That's what we talked about in the series last week. Don't miss that. Or go back and read the book of Job. Go back and look at last week's sermon series and see if that's not exactly what happens in the life of Job. Chuck Swindoll, he says it this way. He says, it's doubtful that, in fact, he doesn't say doubtful. He says, God never uses anyone that he hasn't crushed first. I got to tell you, the first time I heard him say that, I was like, then who would want to do it, right? I mean, I don't think I want to be crushed until you understand what it means. A.W. Tozer, the great theologian, he said this. He says, it's doubtful that God has ever blessed anyone that he hasn't hurt deeply. That's so weird, right? Yet we look at the life of Job and we say, that's true. By the way, if we go back to the person that comes before Abraham, the great leader before Abraham, Joseph, he was given a vision by God that God said, hey, the nations of the earth and your own brothers and your own father and mother are going to bow down to you. That's the vision. He was not very smart. He was very immature, not realizing that God could give you a vision, but this isn't the right time to share that vision. So he went to his brothers and said, hey, by the way, God gave me a dream that said you're all going to bow down to me. By the way, the dream was real. The dream was actually from God. The timing couldn't have been further off. The brothers hated him for it, you know? It was a split family. If there was ever a dysfunctional family, the family of Israel, this should give us great hope, right? They couldn't get along, and so they had a blended family, and the kids didn't get along. And they said, what? You're going to bow down? I'll tell you what, we're so sick and tired of you. And they took him, and they said, first they said, we're going to kill him. And then like most brothers are like, yeah, well, maybe we won't kill him. Instead, we'll sell him into slavery. And they sold him, and he went to Egypt. And as he was in Egypt, he started to get good. He worked for a nobleman named Potiphar, who was wealthy and influential. And Potiphar thought he was awesome, so he put him in charge of his entire house as a young man. He was a natural born leader. And Potiphar's wife liked the way he looked. And so she wanted to have sex with him, and he wouldn't do it. And so she accused him of sexually assaulting her. And he went to prison for a crime he didn't commit. Imagine being in a country that had no human rights, especially for a slave. Imagine what that would feel like. What would they do to you? What do you think Potiphar would have done to you in prison? You ever thought about that? And between the time of the vision that God gave him and the time that God raised him up to be one of the second in control in the entire world, there was a process. Most of it was in prison. Did you know that? Go back and read Genesis. There was nearly 2 decades that he spent between the vision and the time that God actually used him, and most of it was in prison, in obscurity, in a place that you would think so worthless. But yet something happened in those moments that God created the leader that he needed in the process. This is very important. Joseph became the great man of God, right? And through the process, what did he learn? He depended on God, and then the whole world came, and he saved them from starvation. And that's how they ended up in Egypt in the first place. I just told you Moses, right? You can read that for yourself, right? There's a 40-year span of time in Midian. I'll give you another one that comes after Moses, the greatest king. Moses was the great deliverer, and then later, once they got to the promised land, then the greatest king that they ever had was a king by the name of David. And he was anointed king when he was a young teenager, because the king had sinned against God. But between the time he was anointed king and the time that he sat on the throne of Israel being the great king, there was nearly a 20-year process. Most of it he spent in obscurity because the psychotic king who sat on the throne chased him down and tried to kill him constantly. And he spent 20 years, and he spent nearly a decade in the hills of Adullam in the middle of nowhere in obscurity as God made him into the man of God. Between the vision and the event, there is a process, and God's champions are made in the process. I'm telling you. We'll go to the New Testament so you can see, hey, it's not just Old Testament. When Jesus called his apostles, he called one of my favorite ones. His name was Peter. In fact, he was Jesus' oldest apostle. And Peter was an incredible guy. He was a very enthusiastic guy. I probably relate to him more than anyone else in the Bible. But he could say just amazing things. That's why I relate to Peter. No. And then he could say some really dumb things. And I can relate to Peter, right? He was just impulsive. And that's how he kind of lived his life. It was like, hey, to get over my fear, I can be very impulsive. And that was Peter, right? He's the one, at one moment, he would say, hey, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And the next minute, Jesus is saying, hey, upon this rock, I'll build my church. And in the same thought, he's putting his foot in his mouth, and Jesus is saying, get behind me, Satan. That's Peter, right? When Jesus was walking on the water, he's the only disciple that said, he hopped out of the boat and said, can I walk on the water too, right? And then he didn't get scared until after he tried it because he's impulsive. And that's how he lived his life all the way up until he went through the same process as David, the same process as Moses, the same process as Job. You know what it came for the life of Peter? When Jesus was crucified. He said, I'll never deny you, Jesus. But he did deny him. When he found out that I can't fight my way out of it, and Jesus said, that's not what we're going to do, right? He cut off a guard's ear right before the crucifixion. He was going to fight to the death. And then Jesus said, that's not what we're going to do. He finally saw what Jesus was really here to do, to go to the cross. And he ran away, right? He ran away. And he died inside, right? Just as bad as Judas. He denied the Lord. People said, do you know him? Do you know him? Do you know him? And he denied the Lord 3 times, just to make it clear, right? No better than Judas. Jesus died on the cross and he rose from the dead. And every time Peter saw him, there was a distance. You can read about it in the Gospels. In fact, he left doing the mission that Jesus had for him. He went back to being a fisherman until Jesus came to the beach and he called Peter to come sit with him. And Jesus says, you love me, right? You say you love me? You say, you love me, right, Peter? You love me? You love me more than everyone else. You never deny me, right, Peter? Isn't that what you said? Like a dagger through the life of Peter. And then Jesus does something that seems bizarre to everybody else that's in leadership, which is he says, okay, now I want you to be in charge of the whole church. He left him. The head disciple, that's who he was. I want you to lead this effort, Peter. You're ready now. Now? That's right. You were not ready before because everything you did was about you, Peter. And now you know, right? And after that day, believe me when I tell you, Peter had something in his life where every time he came to a big moment, he didn't bust out in impulsiveness. He paused to wait for the power of God. Are you starting to see that this is a pattern? And he became the greatest apostle. He really did. In fact, if you don't believe that, then read in the book of Acts who preached and the church started. You know who started? You know who got to preach the keynote speech for the church? It was the apostle Peter, who didn't bust out of the doors, but waited in an upper room for 10 days for the power of God before he went out and preached the word of God boldly. This is a pattern, man. The apostle Paul, who is known as the greatest, right? He didn't start off as the greatest, though. If you read in the book of Acts, he was actually a terrorist, probably close to what we would consider Taliban, right? ISIS. That would be Paul. He persecuted Christians. He killed them. He killed them and their families. He wanted to stamp out Christianity until Jesus found him going to Damascus. And on the road to Damascus, he appeared to him. It's funny how that works, isn't it? He blinded him. Isn't that weird? Right? He was already spiritually blind, and Jesus enlightened him. In his blindness, Jesus enlightened him to see, I'm the Christ. I'm the Messiah. And he started to believe in Jesus. And a lot of people think, hey, then that day, he became the great apostle, and he just kept on preaching, and everybody thought he was awesome, and they did not. Do you know, between the time that Jesus called him and the time that Jesus changed his life, there was almost 10 years of obscurity in the life of the apostle Paul. Nobody talks about that. Because they don't realize it's in obscurity that God makes his champion. Because in obscurity, you learn to depend on God. You see, here's what you got to understand. You can write it down if you want to. It takes God's power to fulfill God's calling. That's what he teaches in obscurity. And he says to Moses, almost seems random, doesn't it? And Moses is like, you got to be kidding. Here's what he says in verse 12. This is where we're in for today. And God said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Now the words are starting to get clear. God is not random. This was planned. To us, it looks random because he didn't inform Moses. That would have been kind of helpful, right? Hey, you know what I'm going to call you at age 80? That's not how it works. You think God's going to let you figure everything out? But I want to show you how unrandom this is, because if you think it is, you might think it is, but I thought it was until I found something in the book of Genesis, and I just want to give you this so you can write it down. Genesis chapter 15. Genesis 15, here's what he says in Genesis 15, verse 13. He's talking to Abraham after he calls him out of the land of the Chaldeans, and he says, I'm going to give you the land of Israel to you and your descendants. But then he says this is a prophecy of God over Abraham. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. That's prophecy, right? Is this random? He gave how many years? 400 years. This isn't random. He's on time. You see what you got to understand about God is this. God's timing is perfect. It's just we don't always get his timing because he doesn't come down and ask our permission for it. Get it? You're thinking, well, wait a minute, his timing is perfect, but what is the delay for, right? I mean, 80 of the 400 years I've been alive. What have you been waiting on? God's divine delays are perfect. He's waiting on something. You know what he's doing? He's waiting to develop the leader. In Moses' case, it took 40 years. Because what he was doing in the life of Moses was teaching him his process. And if you don't get this, you're never going to understand Moses. You're never going to understand God's power. If you do, I got a feeling God's about to give you the keys to his power today, if you'll understand this. Here's how it works. His divine delays are perfect. Who's waiting? It isn't us waiting on God. It's God waiting on us. You see, God is teaching Moses something that Moses didn't understand, and it's like Mr. Kemp. That's why I brought him up. Mr. Kemp is such a weird package to come in, but he opened my eyes to see life differently. And what God is doing to Moses is he's opening his eyes and he's saying, yeah, I see what you're thinking, Moses. You're thinking at age 40, you could have done that. That isn't the leader I need at all. If I had wanted somebody full of pride and full of self and I can do this and I can name it and claim it and I can do all this, then I would have called a leader like that. What I need is this. I need a leader that every time you come to a crisis, you depend on me. So let me give you the process, because we're going to come back to it. If you read the life of Moses, there is no way you cannot see this process. Here's the process. God's process to making a leader. The call, the wall, and the fall. Okay? That God gives you a vision, and between the vision and the fulfillment of the vision, there is a process, right? Can I say it differently? There's a wall. That you're going to come along, and here's how most people get knocked off. You see the things in life that you think would be good, that would be godly, and you want those things. That's good. And you go, then God would want me to have those things, and you go full blast to get the things that God wants in your life. I want my family to be godly, right? I want my life to be good and wholesome and have a level of wealth that I can bless other people with my life. I see ministry and how I might be able to affect the world. And then when you get started, what happens? You hit a wall invariably. Is that true? Anybody? There's crisis that comes, right? I've never met the first person that goes out. I'm sure there are people like that. But most of the time when I'm sitting in counseling, I've never met the first person that said, you know what I really wanted? I wanted to just mess up my life so bad. I just haven't met them, right? I've seen some marriages end in some horrible ways. Some of you guys have experienced it, right? But, when I sit down in premaritals, nobody ever said, you know what my goal is? I just want the worst marriage that's ever existed where I can mess up my kids so bad that all the counseling in the world couldn't put our family or me back together again. Anybody? Nobody, right? I've not met the first alcoholic that I sat down with. I'm sure there must be somebody out there that said, you know what I wanted? I wanted to start drinking and just drink so much that it pushed out everything good out of my life. I wanted to take drugs until it just ruined everything. Nobody says that, right? But we hit these walls in our life, and it's like, hey, what happens is we get knocked down, and we get up, and we go, hey, what am I going to do? I'm going to start doing these good things, and you start going. But then here's what kills the vision in our life. Is this true? We hit these walls, right? And when it happens, you know what happens when you hit a wall? When you're going full blast? Don't YouTube this, but look at motorcycles, and if you put a wall, like somebody's taking a corner, and all of a sudden there's just a brick wall there. What would that feel like? Not good, right? You ever hit one of those in life, it feels like? And you know what it does? It knocks you off. That's called the fall, right? I'm not going to do it. But that's how you are. Is that right? Or you might be forward. I always like fall on your face, but that's not exactly right? You kind of hit your back. You get it? And you're thinking to yourself, where is God, right? I don't know about you. When I get knocked off, if somebody cold cocked me today and knocked me down, I would be mad, right? And we start thinking about life, and we're like, God, I was trying to do the right thing, and now I'm mad, and I just don't understand it. And we get back up and we try again, right? Because we're American, if nothing else, right? And we're going to pick ourselves up, and we're going to get back up, and we're going to strive to do. And I'm not down in the tenacity, but then it happens again, don't it? And after a while, some of us are kind of sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? Some of us, we're down and we're just going, you know what? I think I'm just going to stay, right? I mean, what's the use in keep trying? In fact, like Moses, the people I'm trying to help, they're the ones knocking me down. Right? And in the process, God is teaching us something. That's the wall. In the fall, he's teaching us something. What do you do when you fall? Do you fall on your back? Do you fall on your face? Or do you fall on your knees? Now, I know people get down on their face before God. That's good. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is when it knocks you out, and what do you do after you fall? You get angry? I get back up and I'm going to try this, right? You fight or flight. That's what Moses did, right? The first time he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to fight. And he did, and killed somebody. Nobody rose up with him, by the way. It didn't work out good. So then you know what he did? He flight, right? He flew across the desert. He ran as far away as he could get. He's like, right? Then I'll run away from it. God can't use that leader. He can't use a leader that thinks, I'm going to fight. I'm going to do this in my own strength. Imagine if God hadn't taken Moses through this process, the story would read a lot different. This is why God's waiting. Because what you're going to see is this. Is from this day on, for the next 40 years in the life of Moses, from age 80 to 120, every time Moses hit a wall in his life, you know what he did? Oh, it was never, Moses has an amazing plan. Moses fell on his knees. You think I'm kidding? You read the book of Exodus. You will see every time they hit a major benchmark, everybody else was going crazy. Moses is the only one that fell on his knees. Hello? That's the leader God wanted. Because it takes God's power to fulfill God's calling. And you see, there's somebody here today. You're going, but I just didn't know that. I know, but now you do. You see, it could change your life. See, I'm not Moses. I'm not here to tell you, hey, this is what worked for me because I'm Moses. What I'm here to tell you is I'm the bush. There's nothing special about that unless the bush is on fire. And the words of God are what's going to penetrate for you. And what God is doing is he's telling you between the vision that you so desperately want, the vision that God himself has given you, and the event where you're going to see the victory of God, there's a process. And in that process, he's going to make you into the leader he wants you to be. If you don't, you're going to see life as random. You see, today, God is helping you with something. Life is connected. It's not just in the life of Moses. That's why we did a whole series on the book of Job to lead up to this moment to say it's not random. He's not looking down from heaven going, 400 years passed. I didn't know that. No, he prophesied it. He doesn't look at the life of Job. He said, I let this happen. I wanted this to happen for a reason. Now, you might not understand it all, and the point is, I don't need you to understand everything. I need you to know I am God, and when the crisis comes, would you not only have tenacity, which is important, but would you get on your knees? There's not one person that would call Moses a coward. But I'll tell you this, he was one of the most humble leaders that's ever lived because he learned it. You know where he learned it at? 40 years in Midian. This is the process. And what it takes to be the man or woman of God that he's calling you to be is for you to embrace the process. You ready to do that? You see, I know before we go next, believe me, we get to go to a really incredible place, but we will never get beyond. Here's what the problem is, okay? This is why I say it's a success journey, not journey to success, because somebody here is going to go, okay, well, now I know it, and now I've got it, and now I'm ready to go, and you're going to go, no, this process never ends. If you do, you're going to be disillusioned. You're going to go, but I finally put everything back together, and now there's another wall. You're right. And the only one that can remove it is God himself. But it won't be through you striving. It will be on your knees. See? You get where I'm going? Not just physically on your knees. Some of you guys got arthritis, can't get down. Got it. I'm talking about the posture. Are you kneeling before God? Are you looking for his power in this situation? Or do you think you already know everything? Are you humbling yourself before God? See? If you embrace this process, we're going to see it over and over in the next 2 weeks after this. We're going to see it over and over in the life of Moses in the greatest events that the world's ever seen. By the way, it was the making of the greatest leader the world's ever seen. I didn't say that. God himself did. He said there's never been a greater leader than Moses, and there never will be. So if you want to follow a pattern, here it is. I want to add one more thing before we close. Somebody here today, it almost opened an enlightenment for you, and then you heard something almost as though it's a voice speaking in your mind. And it's as though Satan is walking up to you and he's whispering right into your ears, and he's messing this all up. And what he's saying is, well, that's nice, but it's too late for you. You hear me? He's saying, yeah, you tried that before, remember? It's too late for you. You've messed it up, right? You sinned too much. That's nice for Moses, but you're not Moses, right? It's too late. For somebody, it isn't just that you had sin in your life. For somebody, that's where you're at. It's like, hey, I have too much sin. God could never use me, right? And God is saying, I need you to humble yourself and then see what I can do, right? I sent my one and only son, Jesus, to die for your sins, and I rose from the dead, and it takes my blood to cover your sins, and it takes my power, my resurrection power to resurrect your life. I can resurrect it all. So if you're down, get up on your knees, right? Somebody else here today is this. You're going, I'm too old. I know. In a world that we live in, and it gets younger and younger, right? You're not a millennial. In fact, you're a couple generations away from being millennial. You weren't even a Gen Xer, right? You're old compared to me, right? Who told you that? Who told you that God stops using you at 50? Who told you that God stops using you at 60? Who told you that God can't use somebody that's 70 or 80? Ben? Yeah. Right? God uses Ben in an incredible way in my life. You have no idea. He gets it. Do you? Do you get it? Do you get that God's calling? It isn't you waiting on God, it's God waiting on you. Are you ready? You ready to get up off your face and onto your knees? Or maybe, if you're smart, you know what you would do with this process? Maybe start on your knees. You know what I mean? What if instead of waiting for this to happen, what if every day you got on your knees? Wouldn't that be something? Instead of looking at today and saying, well, I'm going to figure this out and I got this and I'm going to take it from here, what if you started off humble before God every day? You know you could, right? You know what happens when you do that? It's not as far to fall. Right? Does that make sense? You're starting to see the picture, and believe me, you'll never read the Bible the same way again once you see this. You will never read the story of Moses every time because you are going to see crisis after crisis after crisis. It should have taken less than a year to get to Egypt. It took over 40 years. Believe me, the task was huge. You want to know why it took so long to create a great leader? Because it wasn't an easy task to get them to the promised land. But he created a leader that every crisis was met with him falling on his knees. I don't think he would have done that if he had never been to Midian. You get it? I don't believe God can use anyone that he hasn't crushed first. You starting to see it? I don't believe God can bless anyone that he hasn't hurt deeply because they wouldn't see their need for God. Embrace this process. We got so much more we're going to share in this series. But for today, for this week, if you start praying this week, like we talked about fasting and praying, maybe just a piece of it, would you fast and pray about this and see what God can do, okay? Let's stand for prayer.